we have sense of entitlement about how exciting we expect our era of history to be. I think we all kind of instinctively feel the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010 just kind of feel lesser. People condemn sort of the fall of the monoculture, but at the same time, it allows people to sort of be individuals in a more sort of sincere way.
You shouldn't seek to marginalize yourself just for the possibility that you could create better music.
Yeah.
I might eat my words on that. Well, cheers, JJ. I don't want to ruin my credibility right away by geeking out. When I posted the first Bandsplaining video and it kind of went viral, I was like, oh, crap, I need to start watching other YouTubers to know what to do. And your channel was the first one that I was like totally diving into. And I've actually, not just how you research videos and like the topics you choose, but the way you do your edits and animations, I have just taken a lot of inspiration, if not stolen ideas. So I have to just,
awesome.
I just have to thank you for that right off the bat.
Well, that's very flattering. It means a lot to me to know that I've had an influence on anybody. This is the 10-year anniversary of my channel, so I'm looking for validation. So I appreciate that.
I'm trying to figure out the best way to introduce you because I'm sure a lot of our viewers will know who you are, will know your channel, but some of them maybe like purely come from the music world, so they won't be familiar. And if you ask me, I think the way to describe you is you're sort of a cultural critic and historian, and you take some of the lesser known or mundane things and explore the history, and you end up with these like deep revelations about American culture, like the history of snack food flavors or the history of beverages. Is that accurate enough?
I'll take it. I like that. I like that summary. I mean, yeah, definitely. I try to do sort of cultural analysis. I'm very interested in sort of American culture, which I'm from Canada, but I sort of consider like the broad kind of American culture that Canada and the United States share. I'm very fascinated with that. Very fascinated with sort of middle class culture. I'm interested in the culture of sort of consumer objects and the sort of things that we buy and fill our lives with, and how these kinds of objects, and whether that's food or fashion or entertainment or whatever, these sorts of things meaningfully define the culture that most people on this continent experience on a day-to-day basis. And I try to do it in a way that's not just kind of like cheap trivia. Hopefully when I'm talking about these things, I'm giving my audience a sense of perspective and appreciation for just kind of how central these things are in our lives. It's not just about like, who invented it or whatever, but it's also just like the cultural role that they've come to function and come to play, and just sort of day-to-day existence. I really like the expression, the rhythm of daily life.
Yeah, we recently did a video about library music, which is like the background music for TV and film, especially like during the 70s and 80s. And I think it's very much in the spirit of your videos, where it's this kind of mundane middle class thing that a lot of us take for granted, and we don't even think it's worthy of a history. But then when you actually dive into it, you're like, wow, I suddenly have a profoundly emotional response to this Twinkie commercial music. Like,
yeah.
So I think fans of our channel will definitely enjoy what you get into, and that's why you're on here. There was one thing in particular in a recent video of yours, couple recent videos of yours, where you're talking about American culture over the last 60 years. And actually, I should back up and say it's all of American culture from its founding. You note that it can be fairly neatly divided into 30, 32-year periods.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I've been really kind of obsessed with this concept of like eras, like what it means to sort of think of history in terms of identifiable chunks. I've long been kind of obsessed with the idea of the Victorian era, the idea of sort of like the late 19th century, like, I don't know, people often sort of say like 70s to like, 1910s or something is like a very formative cultural sort of era. And we call that like the Victorian era. It's kind of like loosely based on Queen Victoria's reign in England. In Japan, my viewers will know I'm very obsessed with the idea of the Showa era, which is a phrase that the Japanese use. I think it's a wonderful term that we are worse off for not having in our own culture, which describes the end of the Second World War till like basically the dawn of the 1990s. Like that was a very particular sort of culturally transformative era in, the history of not just Japan, but like the West, right? The industrialized world. And so I've been sort of trying to kind of come up with a theory of my own to kind of describe this. And I was just sort of thinking about presidential administrations and how you can kind of like, because Americans like to think of everything in terms of presidential administrations, and presidents are kind of like our modern day equivalent of like, kings or something, the Queen Victoria or whatever. So I just kind of noticed that you have this kind of group of presidents who, like John F. Kennedy to the old man Bush, which was this era in which you had like seven presidents in a row who were all veterans of the Second World War. Their presidencies were all kind of like defined by, sort of consolidating the gains of sort of the post-war era. So I made a video a while ago where I was just specifically talking about those presidents. And then I made a second video talking about the presidents from 1993 to the present, basically to 2025. And then I was just kind of thinking, like, these are two, like, kind of like interesting eras. And it's like, can I use this as kind of a launching point to sort of come up with like a cultural analysis? And so I came up with the idea that 1961 to 1993, sort of like the Kennedy to H.W. Bush years, is the Great 30, the era of sort of substantial cultural development and innovation in sort of post-war America. And then the era from 93 to 2025, I called that sort of the Lesser 30. An era that has been defined by sort of less sort of substantial and less innovative kind of cultural developments in American culture. If the sort of the Great 30 was like consolidating the gains of like the immediate post-war era, then the Lesser 30 is consolidating the gains of the Great 30. I think that proved popular with my viewers because I think we all kind of instinctively feel the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and like the first half of the 2020s just kind of feel lesser. Like they just feel like they're not culturally significant in the same way. Like this is a very old take that I'm sure you've seen a bazillion times where it's sort of like, have you ever noticed how like people dress basically the same as they did in the late 90s to
Right.
today? Right? Like that kind of gets at this kind of the core idea of this notion of the lesser 30. The idea that like cultural innovation has kind of really sort of stagnated in the last 30 or 32 years. And that's, depressing in some ways, and you can kind of like revel in sort of disappointment in that. Or you can look at it as a bit of a challenge and sort of say, like, if we can begin from the premise that, like, yeah, the last 30 years, did not produce, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and bell-bottom jeans and Jaws and E.T. and all this kind of stuff. But what did it produce, right? Like, can we look at it with an investigative eye and sort of say, like, yeah, it wasn't as dramatic as the 60s through the 90s, but it did stuff, and it sort of colored the rhythm of our lives, of those of us who have lived through it. I'm 40 years old, so like the last 30 years were pretty formative in my cultural awareness and development. And yeah, and so I'm going to hopefully continue to explore this idea of what was the lesser 30 all about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll just say it's possible too that 30 years from now, someone will look back and they'll see the development of vaporwave as actually a bigger moment than the creation of rock and roll, which to me is crazy.
Yeah.
But we never know. We never know how our current era will go down in the future. So one pressing thing I have to ask you about: what exactly was it that made the Great 30 so great? I know in your video you've talked about major social movements like the civil rights movements, the hippie era, and obviously there's major technological innovations. But if you could pinpoint what some of the key ones were, what would you say?
I definitely think that the Second World War introduced a lot of technological innovation that was then like completely mainstreamed. All sorts of different things, like even like very subtle things. Like I remember learning that like neon colors were something that were developed during the war because they had to sort of create like high contrast like visibility for things like
Wow.
graphs and signs. So it's just like the ability to create like neon colors was like part of the war. And then of course we incorporated it into all sorts of sort of cultural things in the aftermath of the war. The same is true with like things like dehydrated food. The most iconic example is of course plastic, right? Like they developed
Oh, wow.
and rubber as well.
The highway system, the Autobahn.
Yeah, these things were born out of war era developments. So in the 50s and 60s was really like the first time that this stuff started to be adapted for civilian use on a massive scale because it was the first time that we knew how to produce it on a massive scale. The other thing too was just that there was an enormous economic boom on this continent in the aftermath of the war as well. We were untouched by the war the way that the Europeans sadly were not. So we were just starting in a very good position. The war had provided a boost to a lot of domestic industries that was helpful. In the aftermath of the war, there was a sort of great expansion of global trade, global liberalization of the economy in a similar sort of way, and that was very useful for us here as well. Women got into the workforce. Like there was just a lot of like economic things that worked in our interest, which made the middle class much wealthier. They could thus afford to buy a lot more consumer goods. And companies had a lot more interest in sort of pandering to the tastes of this newly wealthy
Mm.
and large middle class. And that included groups that hadn't been previously thought of as being consumers, such as, teenagers, women, all sorts of children, even. And, like there was also just new waves of immigrants. I have to come back to this a lot because I know that like right now it's kind of fashionable to hate on immigrants and even like sort of like how important were they really? But one thing I keep coming back to a lot is just that like immigrants have added so much to the culture of this continent and after the war there was sort of new waves of immigrants from different parts of the world and they contributed sort of new kind of cultural influences that are quite visible to this day as well. So it was just a very particular time. And I think that in some ways, these trends continued in some form during the post 90s era, but we were just used to them, right? There's like a saying, right, where it's sort of like you can only invent the microwave once, right? You can make like a better microwave, but, getting a slightly better microwave versus just coming up with the idea is a pretty marked contrast.
Yeah, and I want to real quick put this in music terms and tell me if you agree with me. It's like the Great 30 era, due to the factors you've mentioned, probably, well, for one, the technological innovations. I actually read that magnetic tape was a World War II invention, was a German invention during World War II that the Americans then brought back. And that's what enabled us to have hi-fi sound for the first time. That's the first time we could record the full frequency spectrum. So
Mm.
it's like one day you couldn't capture sound in high fidelity. The next day you could. We kind of forget that there's one day where that happens. But anyway, thanks to these innovations and the growing middle class in consumer culture, you have the emergence of just tons of new music genres. Rock and roll, just pop music as a genre was
Mm.
kind of emerged in the late 60s. R&B, soul, metal, disco, punk, new wave, house, techno, all of these were from the Great 30. And
Yes.
what has emerged since then? Well, you have new metal, neo soul, alternative R&B, hyper pop, SoundCloud
Yes.
rap. Now everything that's emerged after then has a hyphen in front of it because it's an
Mm.
offshoot,
Mm.
a sound from this earlier era. And I know that you don't dabble in music specifically all that often, the history of music. You do sometimes here and there. But have you ever thought about why that is that, the Great 30 was so much more innovative musically
Mm.
versus our current era?
That's a good question. I actually like what you sort of said about hyphens. I was just wanted to write that there, and because I suppose you could say that the Lesser 30 is kind of like the era of the hyphen, right? It's the era in which everything, not just in music, but in so many other realms of life, it's things start to be qualified and made more specific. I mean, I think that the answer to your question, though, is basically just kind of like what I was saying about the microwave, right? It's like you can only invent things once. And I think that a difficult sort of thing to make peace with is the idea that maybe there's just like not that many ideas out there. Like at some point you hit a natural wall. Like there's a limit, even, with the abundance of creativity that we have, like there's only so many things that you can do, right? So I suppose like the kinds of instruments that were sort of mainstreamed in the aftermath of the Second World War, the sort of recording technologies that we had, musical styles that people are interested in listening to that are pleasant to the ear. Like, I guess, like, at some point, you kind of just run out of ideas. Like, there's a sort of natural limit to just how many musical genres it is possible to create. Obviously, you can start to create, like, really kind of like crazy avant garde things, and, people have done that. But in terms of, like, sort of like the big genres that you're describing, rock, hip hop, rap, and alternative stuff, grunge, and all that. And when we add that on top of like the pre-existing genres that even earlier eras made, jazz and classical and waltz and tango and all these kinds of things, like at some point, I guess you've just kind of reached a sort of natural limit, I guess. And then all you can really do then is create these sort of hyphenated genres where you just kind of like mix and match instruments in slightly unusual combinations. but you're still kind of keeping the general styles and rhythm and tone and general sort of vibe of these different types of genres. You're never doing anything that's quite as dramatic or quite as much of a rejection as what was initially done by the pioneers of rock and
Yeah,
hip hop
that's
and so forth.
rejection is such a good word for it because so many music movements are defined by rejecting the
Yeah.
prior norm. And I made like a little list here in preparation of things that were rejected. So like segregation was rejected. For the first time, you
Mm.
could have integrated bands, not just literally band members, but you could explore genres of music that were considered off limits to white musicians, you know. And that's not just white and black musicians, but that's also introducing Eastern sounds, you know, into psychedelic rock. You know, psychedelic music introduced the mixing board as an instrument where suddenly you were layering sounds and trying to place the listener in an environment. You were trying to mess with their sense of time and space. Before that, entertainment was like, hey guys, let's all sing along. You know, now it's like, how can we just, whoa, we're just changing your world. And I think we take for granted even people who like have no interest in taking acid are totally immersed in the psychedelic revolution, just in the way you watch an anime, you watch anything, and the sound is just coalescing around you, putting you in like a new environment, right? So the Moog synthesizer came out for the first time. We had synthesized waveforms, which just physically can't appear in nature. So those are just a few of the things that came to mind for me on why genres were invented then and aren't anymore. And for one, if you have anything more to add to that list, please do. But I also have a question for you, which is it okay? Like, is it a bad thing for the Great 30 to have been a more maybe exciting time? Or to put it another way, the fact that our current era isn't as innovative or exceptional, is that a bad thing? Or is it just that the Great 30 was so out there, was so incredible, like nothing's going to compare to it? We still have it pretty darn good in the scope of
Yeah.
history.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question because it does sort of get to this idea that I feel like he sometimes is kind of implied when people are sort of critiquing their times, is this idea that we have sense of entitlement about how exciting we expect our era of history to be. And then I think this kind of like leads into a lot of sort of the cheap sensationalism and conspiracy theories and stuff that you sort of see dominating like the political conversation and stuff. Is that people seem to have some sort of expectation that every era of history should be equally exciting, equally thrilling, should have equally sort of dramatic things happening. I think that that expectation then leads to some of like the overhyping of things like, AI and crypto and, this kind of stuff, where it's like people
Hmm.
assume that every era has to be defined by some sort of world changing sort of cultural development. And then so if those don't seem to be manifesting, you just become increasingly sort of desperate and persuaded by weaker and weaker arguments about why this or that is actually this generation's, microwave or whatever. I think it's fine to be in an era of sort of less cultural innovation and significance. I don't think it's necessarily a reflection of a certain decadence of our times or a laziness or an inferiority of us versus, past generations. Like I said, like sometimes there's just sort of technological limits that you start to hit after a while. Because it's the same with like the Victorian era, right? Like the Victorian era was the last, before the Great 30, I would say, was the last sort of like really revolutionary cultural era. But then, there was a few decades of things that seemed relatively mid. Like people were mostly just coasting off of the gains of Victorian society for a while, and that seemed fine, right? Like it took a big world war to sort of shake things up in that kind
Yeah.
of dramatic way. So I'm fine living in the era that we live in. I think we have a lot of things to be grateful for. We have a lot of challenges, both culturally and politically. But our standard of living is still incredibly high, and that's sort of like the inheritance of the Great 30 era. And I think that's something to be, satisfied with. And, gradual improvements to quality is not nothing either. Continuing to make cultural products that are, though not necessarily innovative in quite the same way, but are nevertheless qualitative improvements on the things that happened before. Right. So we do have better appliances, we have better food, we have higher quality made clothing. And, I would say that,
Better
the
music.
better music and better movies and better television, right? Like entertainment has gotten better. And I remember actually hearing this come up once where they were sort of saying that the improvement in the quality of our entertainment is one of the great sort of underrated variables in explaining a lot of things about the way society is today. Whether that's why we're not being as social as we used to be, whether that's like why we spend so much more time at home in front of our screens than we used to be. Like it's easy to blame the instrument. It's easy to say like, oh, everybody's addicted to their phones and to blame the phone and to kind of ignore the fact that a lot of what we are consuming through our phones, including music, is just so much qualitatively better than it used to be that is sort of has an addictive property as well. It's much more easy to live a life now in which you can kind of just really immerse yourself in really high quality entertainment all the time and then enjoy life that way.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point too, that the Great 30 may have been great in terms of its development, but not everything about daily life was that great. And if you're a musician, for example, one of the downsides to this much innovation is that there's a lot of so many artists who were forgotten and whose work wasn't appreciated at the time because cultural trends moved so fast. Like, they put out a disco record in 1981 and America was already over it. And it took decades for that work to be rediscovered and appreciated. Not to mention, like, you brought up the whole fashion idea. I heard this in a recent video by Adam Conover that if you watch the TV show The Office, the fashion looks virtually the same today as it did then, even though that show debuted 20 years ago, in 2005. Now, go back to the 1980s, and if you're wearing 1960s clothes in a 1980s office, everyone's going to think you're crazy. They're going to be like, what wormhole did you just step out of? Is that a good thing? I mean, to me, that signals like the need to be current and on trend at all times and to have the latest wardrobe. That's actually like, especially for the anti-consumerist crowd, which you have good critiques of, that's actually a bad thing. So that's the rat race. That's keeping up with the Joneses, You constantly have to innovate yourself just to stay relevant in society. Now we're actually taking a breath and we have the whole world's history available at our fingertips and we're just appreciating stuff from prior eras. And if you wear 60s clothes as a high school kid, I don't think people will really bat an eye. They'll be like, oh, look at what Jimmy's wearing today. Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yes, those are some good insights. We do live in an era now, and this is sort of something that people comment on a lot, is that we live in an era of sort of personal curation, where you can really sort of craft your own kind of cultural experience in a way that was never quite popular before. At a time where, yeah, dominant social trends felt like they were much more sort of smothering and demanding, and the pressures for conformity were much higher. People who were non-conformists were marginalized, right? Like that's sort of something that
Right.
starts to really emerge in sort of like the last few years of the Great 30, right? Is like the idea of being countercultural, with being okay, actually, that those kind of people can be perfectly fine and be integrated. And then I think in sort of the lesser 30, you see that happen to an even greater extent, where kind of countercultural movements themselves go mainstream, or at least find an audience that's willing to embrace these things in a kind of proud and open way. And then you kind of do, in some ways, you're seeing the fulfillment of the American promise in a more sort of sincere way in the lesser 30, whereas there becomes a sort of true appreciation of diversity, a true appreciation of diversity of tastes, right, and of lifestyles, and that you can be however you want to be. People condemn sort of the fall of the monoculture, right, and there are sort of downsides when the sort of society becomes more atomized and fractured. It becomes maybe a little bit harder to kind of find cultural common ground with people, but at the same time it allows people to sort of be individuals in a more sort of sincere way, and to chase their own passions and follow their own tastes and interests, and and then find communities of similarly minded people online and through sort of modern media internet platforms that allow for sharing and discovery in a way that you couldn't get when
Yeah.
technology was more primitive, like you're saying.
It's a really good point because I'm thinking about the development of disco and then later like house music and techno. Those genres were embraced by the LGBT community at
Mm.
the time. And there was a lot of darkness and despair in that music, maybe less so disco, but much more so
Yeah.
techno house. And that has to do with how marginalized it was to be gay at that time and dealing with the AIDS crisis and everything. And okay, so nowadays it's become much more mainstream. You know, we don't have nearly the same repression of LGBT communities. And maybe the music is less vital. You know, maybe you don't quite feel the danger in it as much. But is that a bad thing? It's like, no, like you said, it's ultimately it's the fulfillment of the American dream to
Yeah,
no
yeah,
longer be a marginalized community. And you
yeah,
shouldn't seek to marginalize yourself just for the possibility that you could create better music.
yeah.
I might eat my words on that because maybe some people should just so that they can produce it for the rest of us to enjoy. But personally, I'd rather have a happy, violence-free existence.
Yeah, no, I mean it's a good point, right? Like, I mean, obviously these sorts of things are trade-offs from a sort of cultural and historical perspective. But yeah, I think on the whole, we should all be happy that there are fewer marginalized sort of subcultures than there used to be, even if that maybe means that yeah, you're sort of seeing less cultural output produced through the circumstances of suffering, right? One thing that I think about a lot is, this doesn't really have that much to do with music. Well, maybe it sort of does, but it's like drag, like how mainstream that is. Like you see like drag queens, like, hawking like sodas on billboards and this kind of stuff. And like drag queens become like big popular sort of celebrities, right? I mean, this is obviously something that has a sort of like political, controversial dimension, but it is just kind of like interesting to me that this is something that would have been like at one time like really the example of like the nichest of the nichest underground subcultures, and now you can have like a big reality show like RuPaul's Drag Race, and this becomes like one of the most sort of popular shows in America, and it's just sort of like a thing that's sort of celebrated, and the drag queen just kind of becomes a sort of stock character of American life and no longer quite this sort of like deviant underground sort of figure. And this is the problem with the politics of it, right? If drag queens aren't your thing, no one's forcing you to like that kind of stuff. We live in an era in which, because there is no monoculture anymore, you are free to consume anything that enjoys your taste. There are not people that are forcing you to embrace these things under sort of threat of sort of social marginalization. There's always going to be a community that's willing to embrace whatever your taste happens to be, and it's not hard to find them.
Yeah, there's not one single TV show. There's not the late night show that every American watches. So if the
Yes.
Beatles on it, then all of America's going to see them at once. Yeah, you don't have to watch RuPaul's Drag Race if you're triggered, or if you just prefer not to watch it. You
It's
know.
it's funny like with the Beatles too, right? Because like when the Beatles came, like they were such a dominant sort of cultural phenomenon, as I'm sure you know, right? It's just kind of like everybody kind of like had to weigh in on the Beatles. Like everyone had to kind of like have their hot take. I have this great book. It's called Read the Beatles, and it's just like all like these like essays and things that were published contemporaneously with the time, right? And so it's like
Oh, I need
people,
to check that out.
it's really good, right? Because it's kind of like, like everybody in like society, mainstream, like American and English society had to have their take because it was just like so omnipresent, right? But nowadays, it's like you don't have to have a take on Taylor Swift or whatever, right? Like it's just easy to ignore things you're not interested in. It's easy to embrace things you are interested in. And I think there's something healthy about that. It's a true sort of like live and let live and sort of the taste in the realm of taste.
Yeah, and you're already starting to answer this question, but I need to lay it on you nonetheless. There's a lot of critics who will say the reason the lesser 30 has been less profound is because of capitalism or neoliberalism or
Mm.
commercialism, insert the word, and this is sort of the Jacques Derrida, Jean Baudrillard. I'm going to butcher those French names because we don't take French here. Um,
Good.
it's the post-structuralist argument. There's a couple people who have made this argument specifically towards music. They're actually really cool philosophers, Simon Reynolds and Mark Fisher. But
Mm.
you're familiar with this argument, I assume, to some extent?
Of course, yeah.
If you had to steel man it, how would you steel man?
Well, I suppose just kind of like the idea that I suppose as sort of capitalism marches on, things become much more sort of pandery to public tastes in a kind of like very kind of crass and sort of simplistic, kind of way. It's kind of like the idiocracy sort of type of argument, right? In some ways, it's like quite a sort of snobbish argument. It's like the public are basically kind of like vulgar simpletons, and that sort of the natural state of capitalism is to sort of pander to the desires of the vulgar simpleton, which is to sort of say that like as things go on, you'll just basically produce things that don't challenge the public in any real way, that just sort of reaffirm tastes that we know the public already has. And, like this is then the sort of thing like, oh, and this is why we have like 10,000 Marvel movies or whatever. It's just that's what we know will sell, as opposed to in sort of the Great 30 era, the argument would be that people, that maybe we didn't have as immediate market data. We didn't see instantaneously how many views or how many listens every piece of media that you post online gets, within a second. That sort of lack of immediate response meant that we had a market system that was a little bit less informed. And so artists and creative types were a little bit more willing to take chances on new things. And now, with so much market data, the big corporations that run everything are just very risk averse, and they're only going to go with what they know will generate immediate profits, right? And it's not a completely illegitimate argument. I mean, I'm sure you've heard people make these kind of claims before, where it's like, okay, I wanted to be associated with, a big label or a big brand or whatever. And they were like, that stuff seems kind of risky. It's like, oh, we don't know if that's really going to go. Audiences like this. Why don't you just do that? Right. And so
Yeah.
that's fair. I think it's overstated, but there is a case to be made that certainly when you look at some of the big blockbuster stuff, it does sort of seem like it does conform a bit to that argument. But I would just sort of say that, like we were saying before, there's never been more opportunities for alternatives, right? So even if you
Yeah.
don't like the top tier stuff, it's very possible to make, a reasonable living and have a very successful career, appealing to a different subculture. Perhaps it's a smaller one, but still, a large enough one that it can sustain a lot.
Yeah, and I know you were tasked with steel manning, so I shouldn't respond to you like, oh, I disagree. But
Yeah,
2 points on that is like, for one, the idea that in the past people weren't risk averse is kind
yeah,
of ridiculous, because in the 50s, specifically when rock and roll first emerged, no major label would touch it because it was race music and that was too risky for them to release. And at that time, fortunately, there were small independent labels such as, believe it or not, Atlantic Records was at that time a newly emerging independent label, and they were willing to push rock music, and that's why we have it today. And the other thing too is, yes, I agree. Like, as far as music goes, the music on the Grammys has become less and less risky over time. There's less of a diversity of music. There is quite a bit more conformity in pop music. There's definitely outliers and interesting artists, but I think the number of people I know who watch the Grammys, it has plummeted. And I think it's become less relevant to the general public. Maybe at some point in the 70s, it was like 2/3 of American televisions would watch it, as well as the Academy Awards. Now it's that number is just dropped and dropped and dropped. And at the same time, there's just tons of micro communities, micro genres for you to find your community with. And even better, a decent number of artists can make a living off of recorded music without ever winning a Grammy or without ever appearing on the Billboard chart. Um, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, the artist that, Aldo, who's E-Spirit again? The Vaporwave artist who,
George Clinton.
George Clinton. I that's just the first one who comes to mind. An artist who will never be on any mainstream chart, but is beloved and will probably have a long career in music. I mean, there's countless examples.
And he dictates nowadays what is cool, pretty much, because whenever he releases a single, I feel like 1,000 other artists are like, oh, we should do this. But like, he's not mainstream. And it is absurd that someone that's not mainstream has that much influence in music in general.
Yeah.
it's like what you were saying as well, because it's harder to assert sort of the existence of a mainstream for that reason. And when you talk about sort of like the decline of things like the Grammys, that's revealing of sort of the breakdown as sort of like as a monoculture breaks down, we have sort of less reverence for these kind of like elite institutions that sort of exist to kind of curate and judge and decide and sort of organize into hierarchies about what matters with like a capital M. It's just kind of a natural sort of outgrowth, is that these kind of legacy institutions that existed in a more conformist and more elitist era would naturally fall. And that's, that's not an unequivocally good thing, right? Like those things are part of the culture as well. And it's always sad when sort of cultural institutions decline, but it's natural, right? Like there's a sort of natural life to culture, and things rise and fall, and as culture changes and as the public's ability to assert itself changes, I think it's sort of natural that kind of gatekeepy things become a more sort of marginal presence.
Right. Yeah, another argument that I hear specifically related to music as to why the lesser 30 has been less prominent is
Mm,
that in the immediate post-war era, the greater 30, there was a lot more public funding of the arts. Less so in the US, but much more so in the UK, and I believe even in Canada. I think, am I
yeah.
wrong, or did Nickelback get some grant to fund their first album?
I mean, I don't know if this is the case in England as well, but in Canada, there's like kind of laws that force you to
The
play
radio
on the
laws.
radio, right? I saw like some sort of like TikTok thing the other day where it's like songs that only like Canadian millennials think were popular just because the laws forced them to be played. And it's just like these songs that like I never remember anybody really liking, but they were just kind of like the background music of my generation just because they were made by Canadian artists and the Canadian laws required these quotas to be filled.
Was that the same in Brazil, Aldo?
Yes, yes. It was and still is.
Uh,
It's the same. It's still the same in Canada, right? It still exists, or has it been scaled
Yeah, I mean,
back?
it's been lessened a bit, as the free market sort of as neoliberalism triumphs on. These kinds of things are not quite as prominent as they used to be. But yeah, it still does exist. Longtime viewers will know that I've actually been fighting the Canadian government to ensure that these sorts of quotas do not come to the internet, which is sort of the next
Oh,
frontier of
right.
what they're trying to do. But yeah.
Yeah, the part of this argument I find compelling is the part that says if young people have a cheap place to live in proximity of each other, so like if college was cheaper, or in the case of the US, we never really had public funding of the arts, but we had New York City, which in the 70s and 80s was a decrepit place where you could just squat, or you could rent a warehouse for like pennies on the dollar, and you could be within a super close proximity of a bunch of other punks, and you could start a community, you could start new genres. Yeah, I think if a bunch of musicians were all willing to move to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where like everyone could rent a house for like a couple $100 a month, I think we could see some profound artistic movement there. Now, on the other hand, the idea that we need a government committee deciding which bands are going to receive the grant money to record in a studio versus a more of a free market, however flawed it is, a free market approach where going viral on Spotify rewards you with the money to go record in a studio. I'm not a big fan of, like, as you said, having more gatekeepers that are potentially arbitrarily appointed figures deciding
Yes.
which band gets to have the career and which one doesn't. That's some Soviet Union stuff that didn't really work out for them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But the thing too that I think is when you can like watch this TikTok compilation of like weird Canadian songs from the 90s or whatever, it's sort of like it mutates, right? Like it doesn't actually create the culture that it often seeks to create. What it instead creates is like a new subculture of like a kind of subsidized artist class who like know each other and give each other awards because they kind of like know how to write grant applications and sort of play the system and all of that. And sometimes the government can kind of try to impose this like very subsidized propped up culture, but the public often rejects it or is indifferent to it, and then the second the subsidies dry up it kind of fades away and is sort of forgotten. So really, like, government cannot create, in my opinion, government cannot create mainstream culture. It cannot make things popular. It can simply create a new subculture among many, particularly in this current era. And that's fine as far as it goes, but in my opinion, like, it is not the job of government to create subcultures, and it's not my job as a taxpayer to fund subcultures, particularly when, if we're talking about health insurance or something, like, there's, you can make an argument about why government should perhaps be involved in that. But if there's one thing the free market, I think, has proven itself very capable of producing, it is entertainment media, right? And so it does then become much more, unlike something like health insurance, which I think you can say is clearly being done in the public interest when government gets involved. When government gets involved in the arts, I think it is much more in the service of the artists themselves rather than the public that is being sort of entertained by the art.
We've made a couple videos on the history of payola, which is so fascinating when bands give a bunch of money illegally to radio stations to just get
Oh,
their
yeah, yeah,
song
yeah.
boosted. And it never really works. I mean, come to think of it, Aldo, the part
It
three
does.
of the
I
payola
disagree.
Part 3 should be all the times payola has worked.
Yeah. I believe it still happens, and it for sure works. I may take
On
this
Spotify.
out. No, like in general, I believe this is a point where I do believe that people can cheat on either system, be it the free market or government oriented. I believe an example of this that we are living right now, a lot of Reddit mods are paid so people can really push their music on huge subs. And this is payola, straight up. This shouldn't be legal at all, but it is. And a lot of bands gone viral because of it. Like r/, they have something like users, and at any given point there are like online people there, and they push in a bunch of other bands super hard every day, and the moderation just let them. They got really famous because of payola, pretty much. So
Okay.
unfortunately it does work still.
Yeah, I mean, it complicates the narrative that the free market is always going to work for entertainment. And I don't doubt that that's true. That, yeah, I mean, I also know of a band that they used recent some Reddit hacking to launch their career. Arguably, they've sustained it through talent since then. I'm not going to say who they are. But I guess it's an interesting topic to me, but it doesn't necessarily negate the fact that the free market, while flawed, is the best that we have.
Yeah.
You
I
know?
mean, there's definitely like the real free market purists would say that, the existence of sort of corruption does not negate the virtues of the free market, that this is like some sort of twisted deformity of what is supposed to be a purely public demand driven system, and that once you have sort of conspiracies behind the scenes to kind of twist public demand or sort of mask what true public demand is, that you're getting something beyond a free market. You're getting a kind of like, yeah, just a system of corruption basically. So
yeah, and I think even like the extreme free market people, they might say, well, let's just make it all transparent. Like if you want to buy Reddit likes, let's just let Reddit sell that option. And if you have a song and you're really confident in it, pay $5,000 to have Spotify add it to a bunch of people's playlists, and then see if it works out for you or not. And
yeah, I'd be fine with that as long as it's transparent. It's sort of like how you, on like Instagram, right? Like in your stories and stuff, you'll see posts where it's like, I don't know, some artist or musician or somebody like trying to pitch themselves, and you'll see that it's like an ad or it's sponsored, and it's like, you'll be a little judgmental of that, but you'll also be like, maybe sometimes you're open-minded and it's like, okay, this was paid, but I'm intrigued, right? But no, it's the transparency, and thus, if anything, I think that you're more willing to sort of give things like that a benefit of the doubt, right? Because you don't feel betrayed. You don't learn that it was paid after the fact. You learn that it was paid up front. And so you kind of like, you're going in sort of clear-eyed and sort of open-minded in that sense, as opposed to when you feel like you've been deceived, right? People hate being deceived. People hate being sort of made to feel like fools, right?
That's a great point. And actually, that's how Limp Bizkit launched their career. They paid for legal radio ads.
Oh, yeah?
Where their first, I forgot what their first single was called, but the radio station would have a little announcement beforehand saying, like, this is a paid commercial from such and such records. Check out Limp Bizkit's new album. And then they would, I don't know if they'd play a segment of it or if I think they'd play the full song. And it worked. And then people started requesting it, and then they would play it naturally. And there's a quote from Fred Durst where he was like, yeah, it was a super lame thing to do, but it worked. And he's shrugging. It's like, okay, yeah.
That's wild. That's very cool.
But I do think that definitely what you bring up, Aldo, that is probably the thing that makes musicians most bitter about our current system. Myself included, as a musician who's tried to like push my music, is just the idea that corruption and also nepotism, just people who have connections, are able to skyrocket in fame, even when their music isn't even all that good, man. They're not even legit. I'm not really sure what the answer to that is, because again, I don't think it's musicians' unions where there's a union boss that decides who gets the most airplay. But
we actually have these here, like musicians' unions. You can only publish music if you are part of a union here in Brazil.
Oh, you mean like you can't even post it to like Spotify or Bandcamp?
No, you can't.
Oh,
Because
wow. No.
for you to make money with entertainment here in Brazil, you need to be unionized because Brazil is very protective of its intellectual properties because Brazil consider copyright laws like a diplomatic issue because if another country tries to win money using Brazilian culture, Brazil gets super pissed off. So Brazil forces every musician to be unionized, so you can't make money off music. To post something on Spotify, to contract a service like DistroKid, you need to be part of a union
Oh
because
my God.
the
Wow.
money have to pass through the government, then it gets back to you.
And do they have any control over like which musicians are going to be promoted more or anything like that? Can the union
No,
determine? It's just purely for receiving your royalties.
yeah.
Okay.
This and also give more airtime to Brazilian musicians, like so our radio stations are not just like foreigners playing, you know.
Yeah, gotcha. It's really just me thinking out loud about the current state. I mean, you could apply this same argument to entertainment in general, film, TV,
Yeah.
whatever people are into. There's this extreme sense of excitement that, hey, I'm working on this graphic novel. Once I'm done, I'm going to post it to Reddit and I'm going to share it with the world. And you're kind of dreaming that it's going to go viral and you're going to start your career this way. And a lot of people face the reality of you work so hard on your thing, you post it, and it's just the internet void that it gets sucked into. And it's very easy for people to feel bitter about that and to blame our free market system as sort of the culprit. I mean, do you encounter that?
Yeah, I mean that's always been the harshest thing about a free market system, right? Is that it does create winners and losers, and the public is fickle, and like why some things sort of catch on with the public and other things don't can often be very mysterious and inexplicable and feel arbitrary, right? I mean, I certainly see this all the time on YouTube, right? You see, like YouTube is a great sort of free market based kind of platform, and you see channels that are super popular, and sometimes that seems just, and sometimes it seems unjust, and sometimes you see a small channel that you watch and this video is amazing and you think like, oh, this should have way more views. In fact, that will often be in the comments like, how does this only have 5,000 views or whatever? Why do you only have like 5,000 subs when so and so over here who does nothing but delivers slop to the audience or just regurgitate other people's work, and like why has he got 5 million subs and everybody love him, and why is he a millionaire, right? It's just, I don't know, life is kind of unfair in that way. But the problem is that I think we've learned that, you just create new sort of forms of inequalities and injustices when you try to get, sort of gatekeeping type authorities putting their hands on the scale and trying to create a sort of artificial sense of fairness. This, not to get sort of too political or high-minded or philosophical about this, but this is one of the great sort of challenges of economics in the 20th century, and attempts to sort of bring more equity and sort of economic justice in that. And I think that we've sort of found that the best, in my opinion, sort of the best case scenario is just have a free market economy with strong sort of legal protections so that people are not scammed and hustled. But you can't create a system that yields perfect outcomes for everybody, that yields success for everybody, certainly. Nobody is entitled to success, in my opinion. Success can manifest in ways that feel arbitrary or unjust, but that doesn't mean that anybody has a right to it.
Yeah, in my own situation, like my primary identity was being a musician in a band for, since I was like 11 years old. And my whole life revolved around gigging, touring, putting out albums. And I never saw any sort of viral success, beyond like local success in music. But then the first video I put out about music history took off. And it's like, well, that wasn't the thing I had in mind, but I'm just going to go. I'm going to be very grateful that I have an avenue open. And it makes me curious. So how did your channel take off, JJ? You were a writer and a kind of a public intellectual before YouTube?
Well, I was like a TV. I wouldn't oversell myself too much, Jeremy. I was like a TV talking head sort of pundit guy. Like I did a lot of television news. Like I was like one of these guys that sort of offers spin.
Were you the youth correspondent at that time?
I guess I was yeah, actually the first panel I did was, I forget what it was called now. It was called like Political Express, I think, and it was on one of these local all-day news channels here in Canada, and I was like the 11 a.m. segment Or I was like on a panel where, they'd say, "Oh, Prime Minister is up to this and that these days. And what do you think about this, JJ?" And it's like, "Well, Todd, I think that it looks bad for, like this kind of thing." And I got that job initially because I was a blogger, actually, real sort of lesser 30 job to have. I was doing a lot of blogging, and through the blogging, I kind of got on the radar of some television producers who gave me jobs to do that. And then I was sort of always doing back and forth between TV and writing, and the one sort of feeds into the other in the world of political commentary. But then the television station that I had been working for went under in 2015. It was a sort of smaller Canadian news network that was trying to compete, I think, at a time in which people were moving away from cable channel news, certainly to get their political hot takes. This was obviously the time that all of these channels and characters that we know and love today were sort of starting to rise in prominence in terms of the realms of political commentary. And so the station shut down. And then I just reached the conclusion that it's like, maybe I should give this YouTube thing a try. I'm of a generation that didn't really grow up with it in a way that I think like the Zoomers did. But I was kind of like dimly aware that this was something. And, I was comfortable being on camera. Obviously, I like to yap. So I was like, could I give this a try? And so I did. And the thing is, I think this reflects my kind of millennial out of touchness, was that it's hard for me to exactly remember when I started becoming popular. Like, I just didn't go into YouTube having a clear sense of what popularity looked like what was good, what was realistic expectations to expect. I see a lot of young people that go into YouTube now, and if they're not, having a million subs within the first few months, they feel like they're a failure. Whereas I guess because I was a little bit more ignorant of the culture of the platform, I was willing to kind of play the longer game and just kind of like enjoy whatever meager successes arose. And then, yeah, but now I'm a full-time YouTuber. It's all I do for work. I don't have any other jobs, and I make a comfortable living doing it. And yeah, it's the best job I've ever had, and I've been doing it for a decade. So
You wouldn't want to go back to being on panels on TV,
I
except
mean,
maybe now and then.
well, I mean, sometimes, even though as we've been discussing, like we live in sort of a post-monoculture sort of era in which gatekeepy things matter less than ever before and are less popular than ever before, you do still kind of crave the validation that these kind of legacy institutions can offer, right? It's just like no musician would turn down a Grammy, even if in the next, second he could say, well, Grammys don't really matter anymore, right?
Right.
There's just sort of a prestige. And that's a reflection of culture as well, is that we all sort of inherit the culture that came before us. We all sort of internalize what matters and what doesn't by references that we see in movies, and what our parents talked about, and sort of what we grew up sort of understanding to matter in some sort of broad way. So yeah, I do sometimes miss being on television, just because like TV seems important in a way that YouTube just doesn't quite. Even though like objectively there's lots of YouTubers who command a much bigger audience and make more money, and more people know who they are, but it's like, when you go into that big sort of television studio and with all the lights and the cameras, and everybody's like has their makeup done up, and it's just like it's very glamorous in a way that feels like this is what success is supposed to be like. you
Yeah.
know?
I'm a few phases behind you in this, but I got invited to my first like YouTuber conference networking event, and I was just like, "Oh my God, free pizza? Free beer? Whoa." It was just like a feeling of like, "Oh man, I've made it," or at least I'm on my way.
Yes,
Um,
yes, yes.
a very sort of legacy concept of having a banquet, getting a bunch of people together in a room and talking about how we're going to spike the water supply next year and control the weather.
I have something to share that has to do with a consumerism video, JJ's consumerism video.
Yes.
By the way, amazing video. I loved it. I
Oh, thank you.
never heard of your channel before Mr. Bandsplaining showing to me, which, by the way, is that the free market can be a bit rough, because that is exactly the type of content that I love, but I was never exposed to your channel. So that's unfortunate, but now I know about it. So yeah.
JJ, how's your Brazilian segment on your demographics?
My Brazilian segment, I don't know. I mean, the old cliche about how if you ever acknowledge Brazil in any way, the Brazilians are all so
Yeah.
delighted. I remember
Exactly.
I once did a video where it's just like on my my computer screen, completely incidentally, I had like a picture of like some Brazilian like cookie brand or something. I don't even remember what it was. But like so many Brazilians in the comments are like, "Oh, you know this?
You
How do you
know,
know this?"
now I know because when I was going through your videos to send to Aldo, one of them you talked about all the different cultures that contributed to American culture, and you had Brazil up there in big letters. That
yes.
probably drove half your traffic right there.
So you guys were talking about your YouTube career, how it started, and like my inexistent YouTuber career started and ended pretty much with a video that I did. Like I had done at the time, I believe 5 videos that I kind of work hard. Like I did studied the script and everything. And then I bought this like headphones that I don't even own anymore. And I made a review of it. And people started to comment stuff that you pointed like, oh, how is this channel not any more popular? This is a really good video. And at the time, in my previous videos that I worked super hard, I only got like, I don't know, 2 comments and 20 views. And this video, out of the blue, like in a week, got like 30,000 plays. And I was like, oh my God. And it was a headphone review. But then I noticed that a lot of people watch gear reviews to justify their purchase and not because they want to get informed. So
they're fans. It's like a fandom.
Yeah. There is a small portion that uses consumerism as a bony experience. Like, I'm a guitarist. I believe you can. So I really like gear. Gear inspires me to do music. Like, this is consumerism. And I have bonded with other guitarists that don't even play the kind of music I do, but like you want a Red? I never played a Red, but the dude like plays something that I don't like hearing, but we connect through consumerism. So I believe that consumerism can be cool. But then I saw this other face of consumerism that people kind of get pissed off if you say something bad about something that they just bought,
Yes.
And when I saw that a lot of people, it really didn't feel right for me to have that video, so I deleted it because I didn't want to be part of this culture of incentivizing people to buy stuff.
It's interesting what you sort of said about like the idea that these videos can like validate a decision that's been already made as opposed to helping people make a decision, which is what we tend to think they are. And then that people would get angry if you're seen as sort of undermining or mocking or insulting a decision
It's like
made, particularly when they've spent a lot of money on it, right?
It's like their sports team in a way.
Yeah.
Is the way I'm gathering.
Yeah.
And if it's a way that people derive meaning and passion in their lives, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If they start to literally lose their shit and it ruins their day to see a bad review about a pair of headphones, then okay, that's a little bit unhealthy.
There were like, I don't know, 7, almost 10 comments because one of the things that I criticize about these headphones in question is that if you wore them like this, it was super uncomfortable. I just said this, like, it is uncomfortable. Don't do this because it can hurt you. And people were like, excuse my language, but they were, this is not a neck pillow, you oh my God.
Right.
I'm sorry, dude. I'm sorry that I offended your like purchase decision. I was like, dude, it's crazy that people get so defensive about something that is barely a criticism.
I definitely get what you mean, and I think you have to. I think every YouTuber or podcaster or producer claims that they're like immune to the comments. They're like, oh, I don't read the comments. I don't care what they say. And that's kind of all BS. Everyone is like it takes a long time to be kind of okay with it. When Bandsplaining was like blowing up, every video I would make an error. I'd mispronounce a name. Because, we have videos about like a lot of African guitarists. And the first video I made was about Nigeria, and I was calling their capital city Lagos instead of Legos, filled with comments like, well, there's this dumb motherfucker. And I was just on edge like all day. Like, what have I done? Are they going to find my identity and start, I was writing for a website at the time. I was like, are they going to start spamming that website with hate comments, and then kind of calmed down a bit, and I realized like, oh, you know what? It's all kind of empty threats. So I don't know. Had you kept it up, I think maybe you would have felt better about it, Aldo. But unless it was more of a moral decision on your end.
Yeah, it was a moral decision, but I will get back at it. Yes, but in English this time because yeah, I will not elaborate on this.
JJ, I love that you finally put a name to these two eras, and you finally found the dividing line when it's something we've been talking about and writing about so much. And we've been literally having debates on our Discord with our followers, like through voice chat. And like now it's like, okay, here we go. Finally, someone is putting it in writing.
Well, I mean, it's just like, because the thing is, at the end of the day, when you're talking about eras, it's impossible to have any sort of like scientific pretense, right? It's always just going to be somewhat arbitrary. You're going to come up with a beginning point and an end point that will always be debatable and disputable and all that. So I don't know. This is my system. It's obviously not scientific. It's not perfect, but it seems to work. Like it seems to be a somewhat useful metric. Like sort of the early 90s, 1993 is my sort of point, and 2025 is the end point. And it just seems to work. Like I've just been able to fit a lot of kind of culture into that. And of course, there's like edge cases, and people don't have to
Right.
just like it's a religion, right? But it does, and I'm interested in sort of continuing to explore it, and definitely music. I'm not as musically literate as you guys are, but definitely music seems like one of the interesting things that would be sort of fun to explore. And yeah, hopefully someday I'll make a video that maybe gets into that a bit and just sort of reflects as well, like because I'm at a good position to do some of this analysis because I was born in 1984, so I definitely feel like I've basically been conscious during the entire lesser 30 era. Like there's when I was like a baby and when I was like a little kid and kind of dopey and not really plugged in, like that was sort of in the last eras of the great 30s. So I don't really remember it that vividly. But like 1993 is a year I can vividly remember. And all the way up to the present, like I've been going through it all as a teenager, as a young adult, and now as a kind of middle-aged guy. And so I feel like the commentary that I can offer is hopefully useful, not just to other people my age, but to, younger people as well, that for them, hard as it may be to believe, like the 90s are stuff out of history books, right? It's stuff that when were you guys born?
92 for me, although
92.
you're 94, right?
Yes.
94. Wow, yeah. So that's you guys like a lot of people of your generation, like I have to remind myself that like the 90s is not a lived experience. It is a historic decade in the same way that the 80s or the 60s or the 70s are. And I think it's important for young people to be sort of culturally literate. And actually, one of the big things I'm working on right now is a super ambitious video just about the history of the 90s. And
Nice.
I'm looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching that.
Just to give credit to your theory about the lesser 30s, your video about the last 5 presidents explained in 27 minutes, man, it was like crazy how applicable it was also for Brazilian culture. So I do believe that the way you separate these eras, it really works because you can even makes sense
globally.
it makes sense in a global scale. And yeah, it is crazy. Just congrats on elaborating this concept because yeah, it makes sense. But please,
Thank you.
Bandsplaining.
I was gonna say that we did a video. I mentioned it at the beginning. I was on library music, and one of the concepts we talked about is how millennials and even Zoomers, they will talk about having nostalgia for decades they weren't even born in yet, for the 70s and 80s, and maybe even like a specific scene, like they have nostalgia for the city pop era of Japan, even though they were born in Kansas in 2003.
Yes.
But we talked about how unknowingly a TV show like SpongeBob, all of the music in it is library music recorded in 1960s and 70s London for the most part. And every 90s to 2000s comedy movie, when there's a love scene, they all play this same song, Half Forgotten Daydreams, which was this late 70s library song, which of course has like the wah-wah pedal and the slow funk beat. And the whole point of it was that we actually do have a collective cultural memory of prior decades that's been kind of passed down to us subconsciously, at least
Mm,
musically, through
yes.
soundtrack music. So our sense of what sexy music is actually kind of like frozen in the 70s just because
Yeah.
of that's where the meme was generated. So that's my defense of why, even though we were born in the 90s, we can almost have a little bit of a sense of the Great 30, or someone like you who only lived a couple years. The sentiment of the prior decades has kind of lived on through these
Yeah, yeah. No,
medium.
absolutely. Like when I think of my own childhood, for instance, like it often feels like a very, even though I was born in 1984, it often feels in some ways like a very 70s childhood because like, in the early 90s, like all that, or in the early 80s, all that 70s stuff still
Was
existed,
still
right? Like
there, right?
everybody's living rooms were still done up in 70s style. If you went to like a daycare like I did, the toys in the big bin would be all like 70s era toys because it's, you know, everybody is updating everything around them in a
1980
perfect
hits,
sync.
and
Yeah, it's like,
you burn everything from the last decade, right?
yeah, so no, it is true. It's like there is, and that's kind of like an interesting phenomenon as well, is just the degree to which our own identities are kind of a product of a kind of cultural hangover of the era before we were born. And yeah, that's something
Totally.
that's, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just because it was the first movie, the first lovemaking scene used disco music because that was like it was the first time you could have sex on a movie, and that was the
Yes,
music at the time. And then it froze, and now
yes, yes,
every movie it has that same soundtrack. Now it's a little bit more comical than it is passionate,
yes.
but there's not a sign that it's going to change anytime soon.
There is one music genre that I truly believe that it is a lesser 30s genre through and through. That even though you made a joke about thinking vaporwave couldn't be seen as a huge of a deal as like the invention of rock and roll music, I truly believe it is. I
Well,
really
I
believe it
think
is.
we should schedule another interview 30 years from now at the conclusion of the lesser 30, and we will assess how correct we were
Yes.
in all of our predictions.
I'm down. Yeah.
I remember the first time that I heard vaporwave. I believe it was like the second track in the Vectroid record, the Macintosh Plus Flower Show, and it isn't the most popular track of the record, but it starts with like a CD skipping, and
Oh, right. Yeah.
man, I never heard anything like this before. Like I had very little exposure to like experimental music, but as soon as I heard this, I was transported back to my childhood using my grandmother's old Windows 95 computer with like a bunch of scratched discs, that skip. And I was like, oh my God, I immediately got it. And it is something specifically from the lesser 30s, like people that didn't live this kind of experience don't get it. And so yeah, I do believe that vaporwave is a super important point in our history and
Yeah.
culture.
JJ, you've made videos about like VHS horror, for example, how
Yeah. Yeah. Analog
the
horror, they sometimes call it. Yeah.
oh yeah, how an old medium can create feelings of terror for some
Yes.
reason.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it sort of just reflects, I guess, the phase of life in which we were introduced to those kinds of things, right? Like if you're a child and the world is sort of scary and symbols of adult authority, which, I think some of those things can often represent, in the video I talk about warning signs, like, the FBI warning thing that comes before a VHS tape when you
Oh
play it,
yeah.
like that kind of stuff, or like, this is the test of the emergency broadcasting system, right?
Ooh,
Or
right.
even like there's this whole sort of subculture of like people that are revel in their sort of nostalgic fears about those like movie title graphics, like Touchstone Pictures and that, because oftentimes those logos are correlated with memories of like seeing a scary trailer before like a PG-13 movie in the theater or something like that. So yeah, it's all like, I mean, this is how cultural stuff is. It's all very sort of bound up into sort of our formative experiences that we felt when we were sort of consuming these cultural products for the first time, whether that's, a band that we like because, it reminds us of our youth, or, something like this that is, frightening because it reminds us of a certain state of childhood innocence or fragility or,
Yeah. I just had a case of this somewhat recently. Have you guys have heard of Cards Against Humanity?
Of course,
Yes.
yeah.
Their company produced, as a joke, one Christmas they made a Pringles knockoff can.
Oh, okay.
They were called Prongles.
Okay.
I don't know why they did it. I mean, it was just for the lulz, I guess. It was the flavor was salt and potato, and it was like a like a 90s snack food design, but it was just done up in a way that was like really over the top and a little gross, and it gave me a sense of analog horror. I like my girlfriend bought me one for Christmas as like a joke, and I looked at it and I was like, wow, my appetite is shot. This doesn't look good to me at all. This is like scary. This is fucked up. Yeah, that's it right there.
Yeah, it's kind of uncanny, right? Because it's like it's familiar and yet, yeah,
That's exactly it, right? It's the uncanny valley.
yeah, it's sort of grotesque.
Another small example, since I know you have a lot of Simpsons content, is when Bart is drinking his milk at school and then he pulls a tooth out and he's like, well, what the hell? I always drink mine. And then he looks at it and it says milk.
Yes, with vitamin R.
Right. And that one's not necessarily, maybe, I don't know if it's quite the same, but it has this feeling of like a slightly similar but not quite similar thing. And it does trigger that feeling of like,
Yes.
This is creepy.
No.
Cheers, JJ. Well, we've been super fortunate to have this much of your time. Any closing thoughts before we exit out of here?
No, it's been good to talk with you guys about this. It's always very flattering that when people are actually like substantially engaged with the content, because I am trying to posit sort of cultural theories as opposed to just kind of like reciting facts. I think it is important to be fluent in facts and to learn hard facts. But I also think it's important to be able to sort of do something with the knowledge that you're spreading and imparting to the audience. And so when I meet sort of folks like you who have been watching my videos in the way that I intended them to be watched, and then sort of having their thoughts provoked in the way that I was intending to provoke them, that is very validating to me just as a professional. So yeah, thanks so much for being such attentive and loyal and engaged viewers.
It's the least I can do. And for the record, when you do make a video on music, if you want any hand in the research or any suggestions or just a little fact checking over the script,
Yes.
feel free to reach out again.
Thanks so much. That would be awesome.
All right. Thanks again to JJ, Aldo, and thanks to everyone for subscribing. Although this will be released publicly, so if you're watching this for free, consider subscribing.